Good evening, welcome. We have an important meeting tonight. It's going to be a hard meeting tonight. We'll have very simple rules. You get to present your case, and one person at a time. Civility is absolutely essential. So the person that wants to make a statement, the public who is interested can make a statement. And nobody's going to be here to try and contravene that. So if that is civility, we can hear everything before we even begin to make a decision. I have one person who's requested to speak tonight that's not the applicant, Lyle Henshaw. Did I say that correctly?
Correct.
And you wish to speak tonight?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So we'll call the meeting to order. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda for this evening?
So moved.
A motion and a second that we adopt the agenda for this evening. And we have a motion to approve the minutes of the last meeting we had.
So moved.
A motion and a second to approve the minutes as printed for the last meeting.
Mr. Chairman, you need to take a vote on both, please.
I'm sorry. All in favor of the
Aye.
first?
Aye.
Aye.
All in favor of the second?
Aye.
Thank you.
You want to read what we're going to do this evening? Yeah. I'll dig all my stuff out.
So good evening, Chairman, Board. Thank you for coming this evening for tonight's. I know there was some scheduling. It was originally scheduled for July, and we've done some rescheduling, so I appreciate you accommodating that, and also the applicant. It allowed us all to have enough time to make sure that we did this properly here. So tonight is BZA 2019-0601, Nelson Mendes, an appeal of the determination by the Warren County Deputy Zoning Administrator given on May 1st, 2019 to Nelson Mendes. The determination that was given, the determination was that given the information obtained by the Planning Department for an Agricultural Exemption Application, the zoning application would not be approved as submitted. All structures, which include 2 metal buildings, 1 hoop greenhouse, and 1 deck, require a zoning permit and must meet all other applicable codes and ordinances, such as the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code, to ensure that they meet the requirements for floodproofing as described in federal guidelines. These requirements are addressed in Warren County Code Section 180-16F1A and noted in the determination and a previously communicated violation. The property is identified on Tax Map 36C, Section 3, Block 2, Lot 14, and located at 0 Stony Bottom Road in Front Royal. It is in the Haynes-Anderson subdivision, and it is zoned agricultural. A brief history. In January, the Planning Department staff noticed a possible zoning violation via updated aerial imagery while we observed some flooding impacts, and we were also preparing for an upcoming visit from FEMA. While conducting the research, our office did determine that there was a violation on the property and sent an attached notice of violation that you will see in your packet on January 16th, 2019. Upon receiving that letter, the property owner, Mr. Mendes, did promptly contact our office, and we were able to set up a site visit with him to discuss the violation and possible solutions. And on Friday, February 8th, the site visit was conducted to get a better understanding of the use of the property and the types of structures on the property. With staff from the Building Inspections Department, we observed 2 metal buildings, a hoop house, a deck within the floodplain, and our records did not show any permits for those structures, with the exception of 2 electrical permits. And as stated in 180-16F, all uses, activities, and development occurring within any floodplain district shall be undertaken only upon the issuance of a zoning permit Such development shall be undertaken only in strict compliance with the provisions of this chapter and with all other applicable codes and ordinances, such as the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code. After our site visit, we exchanged some emails with the property owner. Those were also attached in the staff report here. And on February 21st, I stated in an email that our office is recommending that you submit permit applications for 3 buildings, again, the 2 metal, 1 hoop house, and the deck within the floodplain. And please use the regular building permit application that was attached, as these structures will not meet agricultural exemption since they are located within the floodplain. We were able to give Mr. Mendes an additional 30 days to get the applications in to meet compliance. During that time, the FEMA representative was able to come to Warren County, and we were able to schedule a visit with Matt Windling, our floodplain manager, FEMA's Region 3's floodplain management specialist, Mr. Charles Baker, in order to get their opinion from FEMA. On March 26th, a meeting between Ms. Susan Dujak, who was in attendance for Mr. Mendes, Mr. Windling, and Mr. Baker took place. And after this meeting concluded, there was a letter sent on April 8, 2019 by Mr. Windling in regards to findings and opinions of both FEMA and the county related to the structures. And the letter stated, the structures will require permitting since they are located within the special flood hazard areas and will require flood vents and approved anchoring to be deemed compliant. The permits allow the county to track what is constructed in the floodplain and to verify the structures meet the building code and zoning ordinances and comply with FEMA regulations for participation in the community rating system. Following the letter from Mr. Windling, the planning department received an agricultural exemption application via the mail on April 22nd, 2019. Those are also included in the packet. Upon reviewing these documents, we were unable to approve this exemption as stated in the zoning determination while we're here this evening, that given the buildings are constructed within the floodplain, a building permit is required to ensure that correct floodproofing is completed and allows the county to inspect the structures. Our office received the appeal application from the office of Thomas Moore Lawson Esquire, legal representative for Mr. Mendes, on Friday, May 31st. Again, attached is their the original application and their statement of justification. Since obviously there has been a change in legal representation for Mr. Mendes, and that statement of justification was also mailed out to you, and that's why we changed this date. Also included in the report, the applicable code sections, the floodplain overlay district, accessory buildings. I also included some zoning recommendations that were stated that they, in order to become compliant, they would need to get a zoning permit, residential building permit for those structures, a site plan illustrating setbacks, building plans that meet the floodproofing requirements, health department documents, agricultural exemption application, and documents that support an agricultural operation. Some of those documents have been provided to our office that are in here. They're minus the building permit. Also included in the staff report was aerial photos that we used. Those photos are from the GIS that comes from the state of Virginia that we had. Those are public records. We have warrencountygis.org that you can check out the same imagery. Property history timeline that we just created, stating when some of the property ownership changed, when permits were pulled. Photographs taken from the original site visit, the zoning violation letter, email communication, the application or applicable zoning ordinances. I also included some historic flood information that talks about what severe floods and since they've owned the property there, and also it includes their original application and their original the second statement of justification. So this staff report that was sent out was the original staff report. I did want to highlight some things since there was another statement of justification came out and just kind of clarify some of the things maybe that was stated. It is very detailed and thorough. statement of justification from them, and our office definitely appreciates that. And it highlights a lot of interaction between Mr. Mendes and our building inspections department and ourselves, and just wanted to say that we, as an organization, we do work with other organizations such as building inspections, health department, DEQ, VDOT, VDAX, Marine Resource Commission, to use their expertise to help make our decisions. And there was also some question about what is an ag exempt application, what's a residential application, and then also even commercial, it came up in an earlier email. So the ag exemption is for agricultural pursuits or operations. The residential permit, while it says residential, is for anything other than commercial, as I was kind of explained. And so that's what we were asking for that, as it needs to meet some of those codes. I also just wanted to make note that, section pages 14 through 16 kind of suggest that the county is selectively targeting individuals in the county or Mr. Mendes. And our office does not specifically target any individual within the county. We typically operate complaint-based unless we feel that whatever things that staff may see or else comes to mind that it may have a substantial impact on the health, safety, or welfare of our public. And so we take actions in those cases, or we take actions when other organizations approach us, not just complaints, but such as FEMA or the health department, DEQ, those organizations. We've also reached out to such like the health department to make sure that they are okay with everything, request any comments from them. And we also just wanted to acknowledge that we do understand that what appears to be going on there is an agricultural pursuit. We also understand that Mr. Mendes has done a great job trying to construct these buildings and do work on his land. And obviously, as he stated, he has spent, a lot of money to do these things, and we understand that, we respect that. But we just wanted to, again, reiterate that the reason we came to this determination is that the structures are built within the floodplain. And while they may be for an agricultural pursuit, and we acknowledge that, we need to make sure that they are built to withstand all those requirements. And within that floodplain, we do require all these necessary permits. I did also want to thank Mr. Matt Winling, our floodplain manager, is here in attendance if you have any specific questions in regards to the floodplain or that FEMA visit or why we have these requirements. I also want to thank Mr. David Beam. He's our Warren County building official, and he can also answer any specific questions about the building code. But again, this is, while we understand it's an agricultural pursuit, we just have different requirements when something is placed within the floodplain in Warren County. I'm also here, obviously, if you have any questions, be happy to answer those. And the applicant and his representative is also here to give a presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate Mr. Beam, Mr. Wendling being here tonight. Golly, there's a lot of hands that are playing this poker game tonight, and it's trying to sort it out and get input. But before we go defending ourselves, I'd like to hear from your attorney. Do you wish to speak first, or would you want to speak first?
I'd like to speak.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Mendes, would you mind operating my PowerPoint presentation, please? Good evening, Board of Zoning Appeals. I greatly appreciate you being out here tonight and taking the time, and I do appreciate the planning department and all its representatives and Mr. Beam being present. And, next slide.
I can do that if you want.
Okay, that's fine. As Mr. Pais already pointed out, I've presented a pretty substantial statement of justification covering a lot of issues, so I don't want to spend the whole time just reiterating every point, but I want to go through some of the big points tonight. And the first point is, and I do think that it needs to be focused on to some extent tonight, is the fact that Warren County's planning department and building department officials seem to have selectively enforced some of the regulations and interpretations more than anything else unfairly against Mr. Mendez's property without reasonable justification. We'll go into that just a little bit tonight. I also want to make the point that Mr. Mendez's structures have fully complied with any and all Warren County code requirements expressly provided for, as well as state and federal regulations that may take any kind of effect on the property. Warren County's Planning Department has changed its position concerning Mr. Mendez's property numerous times and has yet to justify its most recent position in light of Mr. Mendez's arguments and perspectives, even after the second statement of justification has been presented. And I don't see any change in that position regarding what we've said here to not, what we presented in the second statement of justification versus what Mr. Petty has said tonight. And last, just to make sure we're all on the same page, Mr. Mendez is not requesting a variance as he asserts that he's already fully complied with all applicable regulations. So just to kind of summarize again, Mr. Page already got into this position already. Per the May 1st, 2019 zoning determination letter, the zoning administrator has found that Mr. Mendez's agricultural exemption application, which would have exempted Mr. Mendez from obtaining a quote-unquote zoning permit, was not approved because it lacked residential building permits for the two metal garages, the one roof greenhouse, and one deck. And again, we have to go backwards a little bit in context to get why that matters. And then we can look back at the January 16, 2019 notice of violation, which originally alleged that a permit is required pursuant to the Warren County Code Section 180-16 F1A, which again, as Mr. Petty has stated already, that's for any type of activity that is occurring within any kind of the floodplain space. That must require, again, what's clearly stated, zoning permit. Mr. Mendes was then told by the Planning Department to file applications to exempt his structures from zoning permits, for which he complied and filed on or about April 17, 2019. However, those were then rejected for lacking attached building permits in the May 1st, 2019 zoning determination letter. What the Board of Zoning Appeals should be a little bit concerned about is essentially how the Planning Department, which has the authority to regulate the zoning ordinance and any kind of zoning permits, is essentially requiring property owners to obtain residential building permits for sheds and barns just because they're now stating it's in the floodplain space. And we'll get into more of the legal interpretations later why that does not make sense, but just that's the big picture concern for the Board of Zoning Appeals tonight. Again, I want to talk a little bit about some of the unjust targeting, and part of it, the reason for that, is because it should call into question the credibility and legal positions that the Planning Department is taking tonight. Mr. Mendez, again, emphasizes the history between the parties because it does call into question whether or not this interpretation really is reasonable and really furthering public policy more than anything else. While the Building Permits Inspection Department is a distinct office from the Planning Department, it is no surprise that the office's roles and projects overlap very frequently. The BZA should keep that in mind when we're assessing this whole situation. Since purchasing the property, Warren County officials have referred Mr. Mendez's property to third-party regulatory agencies on 3 occasions. First to the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, second to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, and third to FEMA. 2 out of 3 of those occasions resulted in the agencies finding that Mr. Mendez did not need to take any further action, such as DEQ and the MRC, whereas FEMA merely required Mr. Mendez install flood vents on his structures. It was a very simple meeting that could have taken place even without FEMA representatives being present. Likewise, this entire appeal was premised upon the Warren County Building Permits Inspection Department not having building permits on file for the structures on the property, which is being used to justify refusing a zoning permit. Again, we're putting the guise of the zoning department over the need to get building permits. Now, one of the issues Mr. Mendez has been requested to address has ever begun and ended within the exclusive planning department's control. There's always been a referral out or reliance on a third-party agency. And again, while not a direct issue in this case, Mr. Mendes must also emphasize the planning department's referral of a potential violation to the Virginia MRC calls into question some of the ethics of the planning department under this circumstance. Per the planning department, there was some concern that Mr. Mendez's riverside ramp extended into the river so much that it may have violated the MRC regulations. However, the planning department alleged to Mr. Mendez that they must have seen the ramp from the roadway when first observing their concerns about the ramp. As the attending members of the BZA saw, it is impossible to see the ramp from the roadway. It's virtually impossible to see from the ground level near the deck. Even from the aerial photographs, which we'll take a look at very quickly, the ramp is not visible unless you know to look for it. So there is a concern here about Mr. Mendez's Fourth Amendment rights here when we're talking about searches as to why government officials may have been on his property without authorization. Can't really see from this picture so much, but these are some of the aerial photographs that were presented in the BZA staff, the Planning Department staff report. And again, I'm sure you can look at it yourselves on your own file, staff reports presentation, but When you look very, very close at some of these aerial photographs, there's no possible way you could have seen the ramp in any of these circumstances. Same thing, it was possible to see the ramp. The other thing that caused this issue into question is the fact that Mr. Mendez's property is the only property in the entire county to have been cited for violating Section 180-16F1A within a 6-month period of time. This was based on a request that Mr. Mendez made. Despite numerous visits since this matter began, including even the BZA site visit, no staff members from the planning department have ever stated what, if any, actual concerns they have about the structures. If the whole matter is based on that we're concerned that these structures are not safe, they are not going to be compliant with FEMA requirements or Warren County Code zoning ordinance requirements in the floodplain space, after numerous visits out to the property, you think that at some point somebody would say, here's what we need to get fixed. If you do this and then you get your permit, it'll all be fine. Nobody's indicated any concerns about it whatsoever. Again, I think the BZA should look at this matter and say that at this point, it really has just been a matter of a fishing expedition or a money grab for a building or zoning permit at this point, when there's really been no genuine safety concerns alleged at this stage. The planning department's insistence on Mr. Mendes providing financial proofs that his property and structures were to be used for agricultural purposes after numerous site visits was also unnecessary. Other jurisdictions typically allow for affidavits to establish a property owner's intent to pursue agricultural activities, and again, there have been numerous Warren County officials who've gone out to the property and seen, and as Mr. Petty stated tonight, nobody's questioning at this point whether there's actually agricultural activities taking place on the property. Just in summary regarding this issue, the BZA should give little credibility to the planning department's position that in this appeal it apparently was trying to act in good faith. I don't think we can say it was. And that I don't think that it was really acting with the genuine intent that its office is to serve, namely to, and I put this from the Warren County website from last night, the mission of the Office of Planning is to assist the community in developing the county to its best potential. It's very hard to say in this case how the planning department tried to pursue and further that mission. All right, so let's talk more about what I do for a living, being a lawyer, and talk some of the legal interpretations about this matter. As we already stated, at the heart of the planning department's refusal to grant Mr. Mendez an agricultural exemption for any of the structure of that issue, the planning department alleges that because the buildings are constructed in the floodplain, a building permit is required to ensure that the correct floodproofing is completed and allows the county to inspect the structures. That's essentially, and probably exactly what Mr. Petty just said. However, nowhere in the Warren County zoning ordinance, and even in this particular section cited by the planning department, is there even mention of a need for a building permit. You will not find it. Rather, the only requirement is that a zoning permit be obtained. And of course, if you were to look for whether there's a building permit embedded into a zoning permit, you're not going to find that there either. Even if the planning department's interpretation of 180-16F were to reasonably mean that a building permit may be required, since development that may be undertaken may require conformance to other applicable federal and state laws, Mr. Mendez's structures are nevertheless exempt or otherwise not subject to any further requirements for a building permit. Based on the following analysis, we go into a lot of that in a statement of justification. I'm going to run through it quickly and of course be able to answer any of your questions then. The first thing we have to take a very brief look at is the Virginia Right to Farm Act, Virginia Code Section 3.2-301. As I'm sure you all know, Virginia is a Dillon Rule state. The local governments can authorize any type of ordinances only if the state has already provided the authority to operate, to pass a certain law or regulate some type of activity. So if the Right to Farm Act has any limiting factors in it against a local government being able to pass a certain law regarding agriculture, we must comply with whatever the Virginia Right to Farm Act limitations are. We'll talk about that in a second, but then we're going to look back at the Warren County zoning ordinance based on what we're going to see there, particularly under 180-16F. We're going to look at the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code, and we're going to have to go, and you'll understand the errors in a minute, we're going to have to go back to Warren County zoning ordinance, we're going to find some more references to other outside sources, and the other thing we'll look at is the National Flood Insurance Program regulations. Okay. So briefly talking a little bit about the Virginia Right to Farm Act. The Virginia Right to Farm Act limits a local government's ability to regulate agricultural operations. That's a legal term of art under 3.2-300. Every state has passed some form of a Right to Farm Act, which is why you will see in various federal and state laws carved-out exceptions for properties and structures used for agricultural purposes. You'll even see that in the FEMA regs. This is the core of Virginia Code 3.2-31, the Right to Farm Act. The main thing to highlight that we're going to be discussing a little bit is how no locality shall enact zoning ordinances that would unreasonably restrict or regulate farm structures or farming and forestry practices in an agricultural district or classification unless such restrictions bear a relationship to health, safety, and the general welfare of its citizens. And again, health, safety, and general welfare of its citizens. With the Virginia Right to Farm Act in mind, we turn back to the Warren County Code to assess the planning department's position, as the primary contention is a violation of WCC 180-16F. We look at that first, and we'll go through that. All uses, activities, and development occurring within any floodplain district shall be undertaken only upon the issuance of a zoning permit. Such development shall be undertaken only in strict compliance with the provisions of this chapter and with all other applicable codes and ordinances such as the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code, which is why we're going to be looking at that section in just a moment. Also, anything left in Chapter 180 of the Warren County Code, zoning. And after that, prior to the issuance of any such permit, the zoning officer shall require all applications to include compliance with all applicable state and federal laws, which we'll get to in a moment, but that's where we're going to go back to the National Flood Insurance Prevention Regulations. Okay. So we turn to the statewide Uniform Building Code. As Mr. Petty stated numerous times in his reports and tonight, he wants residential building permits, particularly, that need to comply with the Uniform Statewide Building Code. As we know, all these structures that are on the property at this time are all in some capacity either agriculture or they're really not a residential structure in the first place. And as we can see from the Uniform Statewide Building Code under 13-5-6320D, or what's also known as Uniform Statewide Building Code Section 102.3D, subsection 9, farm buildings and structures are essentially exempted out from the statewide building code. However, it does create a small carve-out that farm buildings and structures lying within a floodplain or in a mudslide-prone area shall be subject to flood-proofing regulations or mudslide regulations as applicable. So saying again, you're not going to have to conform to USBC standards because there really are no USBC standards for a floodplain or for a property in a floodplain. Under the USBC itself, you have to look to another source for what are the floodproofing requirements and regulations. So again, at this point, since the USBC doesn't have any regulations on floodproofing, we go back to the Warren County Code and see where else are we going to find any sources for floodproofing. And one of the next things that we see in 180-16F is that we have to look for any other applicable laws. As far as I'm aware, since the USBC does not have any floodproofing regulations, the next is going to be the federal regulations. If we go to the federal regulations, go ahead. The first thing we'll find is 44 CFR section 60.3 subsection C subsection 5, which requires that all structures located in the floodplain area must be designed to automatically equalize hydrostatic flood forces. I can go through the whole thing, but the long story short is you need to make sure that there's a way to keep the pressure from the outside and the inside equal, and that you need flood vents for. Use some of the pictures. Mr. Mendes did install the flood vents, so at this point, all the two structures that actually could plausibly create any kind of difference in pressure have flood vents installed on them. That's the large garage, and I believe there's a picture of the small garage, and there's a second vent on that garage as well. The other structure is the hoop house, which I believe the two attending members of the BZA saw. The mesh screen is actually bigger on the hoop house than it was on any of the individual flood vents. And there are mesh screens on two of the side walls of the hoop house, so at a bare minimum, it's the equivalent, if not more so, than a flood vent requirement. The other thing to look at is FEMA Technical Bulletin 7-93, which helps clarify that accessory and/or agricultural structures built in floodplains subject to the regulations may be constructed for wet proofing as long as they conform to the following requirements. They must be anchored to resist flotation. Any areas that are below the base flood elevation must be constructed of flood-resistant materials. They must be designed to allow for the automatic entry of flood waters. Equipment must be elevated or flood-proof to above the base flood elevation, etc. And again, at this point, I don't think there's been any allegation by the planning department, even any of their visits, that Mr. Mendes' structures don't comply with those requirements as they stand already. As I just said, the structures meet those requirements, and as those requirements are not relevant to residential buildings, but only to accessory agricultural structures, the planning department cannot logically require that Mr. Mendes obtain building permits under these circumstances. Further, the planning department has not alleged after numerous visits, again, I've already said this numerous times, there's been no allegations that the structures are not in conformance with the requirements at this time. Again, the goal of ensuring structural integrity is, to make sure that things are safe during catastrophic flooding. It's certainly been satisfied. If there's true, 100-year level floods, I don't think the structures are going to be the concern at that point. So again, we have to go back to Warren County zoning ordinance, which at that point, there's really nothing left to regulate from. But we do want to talk about whether or not these structures can just be straight up exempted out as agricultural structures anyways. The planning department has not made clear from its staff report whether it maintains the original position that there are too many accessory structures on the property, which was originally part of the May 1st, 2019 letter. But, as has been raised again, the Warren County code provisions were stated in the staff report and appears to be somewhat relevant. But not only that, related to that discussion is whether or not agricultural exemptions should apply here, and based on what's provided for in the Warren County code. Particularly if we're looking at, Nelson, you want to skip ahead another one?
One more?
Yeah, go ahead. And one more. We'll go back to this in a second. This is probably the most important document for the whole case. Is that as of at least 8 o'clock last night, the Board of Zoning Appeals does not need to get engaged in kind of extensive interpretation of the code because the planning department has already done this. They basically stated that based on the January 21st, 2005 zoning ordinance interpretation, that buildings that are used for agricultural uses shall qualify for agricultural exemptions and not be required to obtain a zoning permit. There's nothing in the code saying whether 180-16F trumps the agricultural exemption that's allowed under the interpretation, or vice versa, whether the agricultural buildings would basically be allowed to be trumping the floodplain zoning requirement. There's just nothing there that clarifies that. And again, as far as I'm aware, the planning department still maintains its official position. It's on the website, despite me bringing it up a couple times now. I can only interpret that as we recognize that anything that can be agriculturally exempted should not be required to obtain a zoning permit. Want to go back 2 or 3 slides? I'll let you know.
How do I go back? Just hit
Just
back?
backspace. We're left, yeah.
One more?
Yeah. Going back to the too many accessory buildings on the property, again, I'm not sure whether the planning department's maintaining that position still as an issue, but it was raised in the original letter and has not been officially dropped. But this is in Warren County Code Section 180-31A, except for buildings accessory to an agricultural pursuit as defined by this chapter. No accessory. Basically, it's saying anything that's considered an agricultural building should not be considered applicable to this section for the number of buildings on the property. And I think that's the only reasonable interpretation at this point. You can say that the last sentence, the accessory building shall require the issuance of a zoning permit. Well, if we're looking at the first sentence, it says except for building accessory to an agricultural pursuit, that should also be applied here where, again, if it's an agricultural building, this doesn't even apply where we need to get a zoning permit. And again, I've already mentioned that we have the 2005 interpretation already looked at. And I've already mentioned that the first sentence makes it clear that the agricultural buildings are unique and exempted from the code. And you also keep in mind some of the public policy arguments for that. The interpretation is consistent with the Virginia Right to Farm Act, again, which there's supposed to be as many carve-outs as possible for agricultural properties. It also furthers the goal of the policy allowing Warren County to regulate structures within an agriculturally zoned area that are not used for agricultural purposes, such as if somebody puts a home up in an agriculturally zoned area. They can't sit there and say, well, just because I have a home in an agriculturally zoned area, I'm covered. No, it matters what the use is. Okay? All right, go ahead.
Again?
Yeah. And likewise, another issue with the too many buildings on the property issue is that the deck and hoop house do not constitute structures per the Warren County Code and even under the federal regulations of the NFIP. Because when you look at the definition, the building has to be so many walls and a roof. And these buildings don't have a roof and walls. So immediately those two can't count as structures on the property. And again, it goes back to if we consider how 180-31D restricts how many numbers of buildings can be on the property, and those buildings are for agricultural purposes, there's a good chance that may violate the Right to Farm Act under those circumstances because it restricts the farmer's ability to be able to build as many structures as needed on a property. Again, this may not be a pertinent issue in this case if the planning department's essentially conceding that the number of buildings on the property is not an issue anymore, but since I've not heard that's been the case yet, I want to bring this to your attention.
One more.
Yeah. So that's kind of the fast run through of the statement of justification. And again, just restating the request for relief, we're asking that the Board of Zoning Appeals overturn the zoning administrator's decision to deny Mr. Mendez's agricultural exemption applications for his 2 middle garages and grant those agricultural exemption applications. We're further asking that you overturn the zoning administrator's decision to deny Mr. Mendez's agricultural exemption application for his hoop house and grant that respective agricultural exemption application. Or in the alternative, issue a decision finding that the hoop house is exempted from any regulation as it does not meet the definition of a building or structure and is not subject to any permitting requirements. Or in the alternative, issue a decision finding that the hoop house is subject to a zoning permit requiring that the structure be inspected for sufficient floodproofing, but that the structure is fully comply with floodproofing requirements. And just to be clear on that last point, what we are saying is that, again, the residential building permit requirement is overkill, it's unnecessary, and it really shouldn't apply in this situation. But if the zoning department, or the planning department had a process for zoning permits that are agricultural structures in a floodplain area, that the only thing they needed to do was meet floodproofing requirements, that would be the appropriate way of having a zoning permit under those circumstances. But as far as I'm aware, and from what it sounds like, there isn't a residential building permit. There isn't a proper zoning permitting procedure for those circumstances, and instead they just kick it over to, well, just give us a residential building permit. That just does not seem to be the appropriate way to handle this. We're also asking that you issue a fine that Mr. Mendez's deck is not subject to needing a zoning permit because it does not constitute a building or structure pursuant to the Warren County Code. Or in the alternative, issue a fine that Mr. Mendez's deck comply with any and all floodproofing requirements and is in full compliance with any and all Warren County regulations. We're also asking that you issue as part of this decision a fine that Mr. Mendez has fully complied with all applicable Warren County zoning requirements concerning his property and structures on said property. And the last request is issue as part of its decision a fine that until the zoning ordinance is amended and modifies the current construction zoning ordinance, structures constructed and used for agricultural pursuits are not subject to any zoning permit requirements except for those structures constructed within the floodplain area, and that the only zoning permit requirements for those said structures require minimal floodproofing safety review consistent with applicable regulations. Again, unless the particular structure is subject to another type of review. If you're building a house in the floodplain, it certainly should be required to go and get a building permit, a residential building permit. Okay. Bringing it all home, Mr. Mendez and his family simply want to simplify. They eagerly look forward to becoming residents and integrated members of the Warren County community. The property demonstrates the love and attention that Mr. Mendez has devoted toward improving his land and fulfilling his vision to farm his land as is his right. And we, just as a moment to actually truly thank you, Mr. Mendez has told me that, particularly to Mr. Faring and Mr. Weckerman, that he greatly appreciated you coming out to the property and making the few compliments that you did make, because it was the first time to him that he felt Warren County recognized some of the value he was trying to impart in the property. And for that, we do thank you. We thank the Board of Zoning Appeals for taking this matter very seriously, and we look forward to your decision. If you have any questions, we are more than happy to help answer them as best we can. Thank you.
Mr. Mendez, did you wish to speak?
No.
By the way, would you state your name and address for the record? I apologize for
That would help, yes. I'm Timothy Johnson. My office is at 20B East Main Street in Berryville.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you wish to speak, Mr. Mendez?
I don't think so. I just thank you for coming out day before yesterday. I appreciate that. It felt like a visit that was done with some neutrality for the first time. That's it.
Mr. Henschel, do you wish to speak? Please, if you'd state your name and address for the record.
Okay, my name is Lyle Henschel. I'm at 305 Stony Bottom Road, Front Royal, Virginia. I am the Vice President of the Property Owners Association of Thunderbird Farms. And because of vacancies, I became president, but I just took over this office beginning of the year. And I have received several complaints, especially in the last few months, about the buildings and concerns if there is a flood that these buildings be washed onto other people's property or any debris and so forth. I've had that type of complaint from the neighbors. Many of us have been there for many years and have seen the floods that have come through and the destruction we've had. Another complaint that I've received from numerous residents is that our covenants state that we can have a home-based business and the property is to be used for residential use. Now, agricultural is permitted, but not a business with nobody living there. And that's what I have seen quite a bit. And we're going to be pursuing and taking a look at this with our attorneys and so forth and see what can be done. Because this is not what the property owners covenants state or bylaws or anything else.
Thank you, sir.
And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm done. Thank you.
Is there anyone else present that wishes to speak this evening?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir. Please, if you would.
I'm Susan Dujak. I used to be the property owner, so I'm familiar with the association. And
Can you
I'm
clearly state your name and your address, please?
Susan Dujak. I live in Arlington, Virginia, 1941 North Utah Street. I used to own the land that we're talking about, and this question is about Mr. Henschel. And I hope I'm getting the name right, but I don't think anybody has ever heard anything about comments delivered to the HOA regarding the property and the number of structures. And, you know, if so, I'd also like to know, or at least on behalf, maybe on behalf of other people, who these people were who were complaining, because I don't think anybody has heard about that.
I have no knowledge.
Oh, I didn't expect you to answer the question.
There was a sign posted there that this property is for consideration. So
No, I understand. I guess the question should be to Mr. Henschel. Who were the people who were making these
Well, we're not going to
complaints?
address that in session.
I didn't think you could. I'm just stating this. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, the reason why we haven't pursued it wholeheartedly is because
Mr. Mack, approach it, we're going to discuss.
Okay, yeah, we were just going to wait until this procedure was over with before we proceeded further, to see what the outcome was.
Sir, if I may, my name is Charles Princeton. I am treasurer of Thunderbird Farms Property Owners Association. And I do have one question for the plaintiff's attorney. Did you inspect the covenants that are recorded with the property to ensure that the use he is making this property is in conformance with the covenants?
I don't believe that this is really the appropriate time for addressing this, but the short answer of this is no, I have not. And I don't believe anybody's addressed this to Mr. Mendes prior to this evening, so this is all news to us.
Okay, well,
That would be outside the scope of this.
okay. By the way, my address is 529 Thunder Road.
We're down at the firehouse.
Pardon?
We're down at the firehouse.
Yeah.
Anyone else wish to speak? Going once? Going twice? Public session is closed at this point. We may call for clarification as we discuss this. There's a lot of things to discuss this evening. Anyone have any questions off the top of their head you want to pop off? Because I've got a lot. And I'll probably hold the table for a while. I have a question early up for the building official. Well, we can't discuss, not within our scope, the building code. But I'm very familiar with the building code, and your hand has been brought to the attention here. And one of them, as I see it, they're in effect three types of permits: commercial, residential, and agriculture. But it's all on one sheet of paper, am I correct? As I see that,
There is no designation under the Uniform Statewide Building Code to what a permit is. It says the local jurisdiction can determine what applications they choose to put forward. The code requires a permit, whether it be residential or commercial.
so if we rubbed out that word residential, we take away a big red herring. Am I correct?
Yes, and the forms that are present have been in place since 1992. We're doing a rehaul with our new software to basically eliminate the actual application and provide it digitally.
Okay. So I saw that early on, that red herring. That helped everyone else for a bit. I'll come back to you, sir, but that was I want to get that red herring issue off.
Thank you.
Early. A few things that I've picked up on I'd like to bring to the boards. I deal with the building code a lot. I mean, each generation, I've got stacks of them on my desk. But there's an interesting thing there, farm building or structure. It doesn't say it's got to have straight walls. It just simply says handling, storage, production, display of agriculture, floriculture, silviculture. Help me on that one. I
I don't know.
That's just trees.
Sheltering, anyway. Just, and there's something that comes back from, I've gone to fire inspector school various times through my 30 years, 40 years in this business. One rule keeps coming to the top. Hey, it's going to be a farmer except for a restaurant. They get to do anything they want. But one of the interesting things in the code, however, farm buildings and structures within a floodplain or a mudslide prone area shall be subject to floodproofing regulations. So we kind of get to that area, as I see it. We use a permit basis to, okay, not rock, I've got something here. Does that make sense to everybody?
Well, it seems to me that the only way that the county can verify that the structures meet the floodproofing is by some type of inspection or permitting. And it would appear to me in this county that our only office that does that is the building inspections office. And I think that's where we're between the rock and the hard place. It's more in the language, and it's not a residential permit per se, but it is a permit that we need. And I think their original statement
Get that
saying,
red herring off that piece of paper.
yeah, saying that, a residential permit is required. I do have a question for Matt. I mean, even on our river lots where there are structures, do those people get a building permit per se to make sure that their buildings are flood-proofed, or do you just inspect it? How does that work? I mean, because we have people who put buildings on their camp lots.
For the accessory structures on the camp lots, as of 2013,
Right.
we were requiring building permits in order to be able to track those and to be able
So we do require.
Right. I mean, it's primarily to track and document the development itself in the floodplain. And many of them, all of them are required to have the flood vents and appropriate anchoring.
But we do that through the building inspection.
And that is
office.
completely done through the building
And
inspection.
I think that's the issue here. I think farm buildings, I'm a farmer, okay? So I'm with you. Farm buildings are exempt, but except for this flood plain. So,
But then again, zoning, you're saying, okay, I want to put a building right there. It's got to meet setback. So zoning is involved. So this guy here doesn't have a barn right next to him.
Well,
I don't want to say that he has the right to kill anything dealing with agriculture, but fire extending from that building to this building is a significant purpose of the zoning. Am I correct?
Yeah, so we do accept agricultural exempt applications. It's a free charge. You still have to fill it out, and you still need to meet the setbacks. We still require you turn in health department documents so we know you're not putting a barn on top of your drain field, for instance. So we still require those types of, this certain type of application, and it describes what the use is to make sure it meets those. Once we do that, we sign off on it, and then you are exempt. And as stated in an email I sent to Mr. Moore, which was in one of the exhibits, we would be exempting the buildings as the total number, the 18031. The total number of buildings is exempt because if they're for agricultural pursuit, and once we identify that use. The reason they're not fully exempt is because we need to ensure that the buildings meet that floodproof because they're in the floodplain. But he can put the buildings there, we just need to make sure that they're
So there's no interference with the number of buildings, nor the size of the buildings.
No, and if they were located outside of that floodplain area, we would
change.
The application would have been.
Oh, okay.
Because it does appear, from our visits and from the original ag exempt, that it does meet all the setbacks. It meets, the health department stuff as well as further up the hill in its drain field. So the buildings where they are located do meet the setback requirements. They just are located in that floodplain area.
so basically what the applicant's asking for is not to have to do a building permit. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
But we get into the building permit because it's in the floodplain.
Correct. When we get the application, they provide that to the front desk. It goes to the building and the zoning. We see them both together. And I'm not an expert in the building code, so we rely on our partners in the building inspections to make sure that it has the right anchoring footers, flood fence per square foot, those types of things. So that's why we make contact with them, MRC, health department, all those departments are involved throughout these processes.
Well, certainly in the FEMA, there's some certain agricultural structures are, a variance may be issued if the structure is used solely for agricultural purposes. But we're not asking for a variance here. We're just saying we need to make sure the buildings comply with the flood venting. It looks to me like our biggest problem is we don't have another avenue for checking that, the flood proofing, whatever, other than through the buildings inspections. And I don't know how we get around that. We can mark off the residential. We can take that off, but it's...
A couple of other interesting things in terms of Chapter 202 of the building code. A flagpole is a structure, so's a stage.
Well,
So when we talk about the dock down there, that's a structure.
but I think the big issue
But
is the fact
it's
that
not a
they don't
biggie.
want to do a building permit.
And I think we got drug into that red herring,
Yeah, well,
because I read
it
everything
just
else.
needs to be a permit.
So-
Flood-proofing permit or something.
Let's kind of regroup and see where we are. Do they have permits, application on file for those structures?
Currently, they have an agricultural exempt application into our office, which was included, that has their health department records, it has a site plan, it lists their setbacks. It does not have a residential building permit associated.
Let me erase that from residential.
Yeah, and as I explained to Mr.
A structural permit, I'm gonna
It's
call it.
correct. It is a little tough, but that's just the only thing we have. And the question was proposed earlier when we first met with him. They showed us that that determination from 2005. I'm sorry if I'm miscorrect there, but that stated that you had to show proof. The owner has to show proof, and that agricultural exempt application was
And
for
he's taking
that.
care of that.
They asked for that because they could not find it, so I sent that to them, but then stated later that they would need to, that would not be approved because it was in the floodplain. We needed the residential building permit. Again, understanding that that's the only permit we have, or that the building inspections has.
So, 1 hour at a table, you could take care of the structure permit for them. And someone can say, yes, I looked at it, it's done. Am I correct?
I mean, once it comes through, the plan reviewers and building inspections would have to review any plans, you know, the flood venting to again, make sure that it's anchored appropriately. And again, the other thing aside from this is the agricultural exempt aspect of it. The decking would not be agricultural exempt. That is, I don't see the intent of that being an agricultural pursuit. That would need a permit. If it's a deck or a porch, whatever, that is a structure in our eyes that it would need. That's not an agricultural. It was also at the site visit mentioned that they stay in one of the buildings on the weekends. Again, we would have to assess that use of the building when the permit comes in. And if it is being used for overnight stays and has a shower and a sink, that would be more fall under private use camping, which is a by right use in the agricultural district and is allowed, but accessory structures cannot be used for overnight occupancy.
I saw a tent there.
Correct. And so we would verify that use to make sure it's being used for the ag pursuit. And if it is, it would be from that. But that was in my notes from our site visit.
All of the buildings are in the special flood zone, all of them.
That's correct. There is one shed further up the hill
So that's out of the.
been from our...
That was for the bees, am I correct?
The apiary had the fence, and then way up at the top, there's an old Leonard building that's, I think, even got a busted window. It's been there for a long time from what we can
So
tell.
we're
So
not
that
looking
would
at
be
that at all.
a grant. Yeah, that's way up the hill. We're in big trouble if the water reaches that.
Well, I'm a farmer and I'd like to just say, yeah, it's all exempt. That's what I'd like to say. But since it's in the floodplain, I understand the purpose of the inspection for venting. I certainly sympathize, like I said. I'm a farmer. I know.
And to be clear, if I may, again, we're not taking a position that like you can't look at the fence. The problem is, again, how this process has been established, and that, again, it's going through as a bill. As long as we're all on the same page there, and that, again, Mr. Mendes is totally acceptable of the flood venting and flood proofing requirements.
And obviously has done that.
Right.
Right.
And just to be clear, I believe Mr. Petty was saying that the ag exemption application, there were also papers in there that described in detail what was done to flood-proof the property. So there is stuff on file at this point with that as
I think
well.
our problem is we just don't have a process that does not require building inspections to get involved, so.
Well, I think what's occurred is Richmond has added this and this and this. What worked 20 years ago was fine, but there's more oars in the water
Well,
now.
we just don't have a separate office or the need to have a separate office to do flood inspections. And I guess Matt doesn't want to do that. He can't take that on. He does enough, so.
Which is not to say that the building department itself could not necessarily do it, but I think it would make sense at some point for there to be a separate permitting process for buildings that are not residential or otherwise in nature, but are potentially exempted and just need to meet the flood proofing requirements. It's a simple, create a separate permit process for something like that. That's really what we're looking for at this point.
Ms. Meltzer, I'd also like to mention, and again, processes are made to be improved, and certainly we can work on that. But
Steve has already said it.
right,
Right. Computerize something, change the whole doggone world,
right, and That's correct. And at the time that Ms. Dujak owned the property, she followed the process for applying for the electrical permit. Again, that was never closed out. So that process wasn't completed. At the time that the construction of these started, we weren't notified in any way, shape, or form, and they were in the floodplain. The floodplain code and our code replicates the federal code, basically states, requires permits for all proposed construction or other development in the community, and then goes on to discuss some other items. But that essentially replicates exactly what is said in the federal code, and that was approved by the county in 2013. So it's a fairly recent update to our county code.
I think if we pause right now, we still haven't solved the final. What it's gonna take is everybody sitting around the table for about 1 hour. Stamp this, reject that. You follow where I'm coming from? I'm not ready to make a call for a motion or anything like that. But I don't think we've totally resolved the issue, but I think we can see the issue right in front of us in a reasonable way to resolve it. This citizen has been pulled around in several corners, and each of the people here representing the county are trying to stay within what the code says, and it just doesn't seem, well, it's like my job every day. It doesn't seem to go in the right circle, and we're trying to work our way in the correct circle. And you being a farmer, you certainly had a
Yes.
sense of the issue here.
Absolutely, but I don't think we have as much, like I say, as much as I'd like to just, say, no, he doesn't need a permit, I don't think we can do that.
No,
So I
unfortunately,
think
we can't.
that, I think the deputy zoning administrator has made the right call based on what he's working with. Unfortunately for you guys, I can't, go against his, overturn him. I can't see. So I'd like to, believe me, I'd like to.
Do I have any motions at this point? Anyone want to make a motion? Mr. Petty, do you wish to add anything before we go to the final session?
I did just want to make a quick note, because we did meet with FEMA, and this, Mr. Winley, we do have a lot of letters out currently to a lot of property owners right now that are in violation due to this FEMA visit.
Yeah.
That for almost this exact
Are
same.
you saying we're going to get more business?
It's a good chance.
Okay. Not that I'm laughing at someone else who's going to be the case.
And as Mr. Winley said, there could be some improvements coming to the code.
Okay. Mrs. Logan, do you have anything you wish to add?
No, sir. I think everything's been said. Mr. Petty, Mr. Bowman.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Board of Zoning Appeals deny the appeal request of Nelson Mendes and uphold the determination of the Deputy Zoning Administrator that the structures do not meet the requirements for agricultural exemption and requires permits. Period.
I have a motion. Do I have a second to that before we have discussion?
Second.
I have a motion, a second. You want to discuss this? I think we're in a position where we can say, hey, table this thing for 30 days and see what comes out of it, and then we move forward. What does the neighborhood board think?
To table it, you'd have to be looking at trying to change the code and making a whole change, I don't know.
If I may, and again, I can't step on the county's toes for how this will work, but again, the point that we're making on our side is that if the way the code works is worded now, with only a zoning permit is required, if the zoning department came out with a process that would allow for people in these similar situations involving the floodproofing to be able to go through, I'll call it expedited, if you will, an expedited permitting process, that would potentially resolve this matter. And I just don't know how quickly people could turn that type of process around, because, right, I recognize that. I know, but that would basically be a way of tabling it and potentially giving the planning department the opportunity to interpret the code in a way that create a permitting process that might work for the situation and further this.
I'm sorry, what?
The structures were already in place when he purchased the property. He's been given conflicting instructions all along, and not to his own.
No, he's just walked down the fire sport coordination line, everybody shooting at him. Well, we have a motion, and a second on the table. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Okay.
Nay. 3-1. Do I have another motion on the table? Another one?
Well, I would propose that I move that the Board of Zoning Appeals approve the appeal request of Nelson Mendes and overturn the determination of the Deputy Zoning Administrator that the structures do not meet the requirements for agricultural exemption and requires building permits. And the reasons would be the structures were already in place when he purchased the property. We know he's overbuilt the deck and the hoop house, we saw that, and he's had conflicting instructions on what's required of him.
Do I have a second to that motion? Dies for lack of a second. So, here we are. 3 balls, 2 strikes. We're here not to make levity of this.
Do we have to make a decision?
We must make a decision.
Let's make a decision.
So,
It's a tough one.
it is, because there's a lot of things in play here. I propose we table it for 30 days and see what we agenda around the table.
Mr. Chairman, the word is postponed.
Ma'am?
The word is postponed, not
Okay.
table.
Postpone? We postpone it. Now, I gotta get into someone else's territory for a date to make this thing happen. We're under your territory now, Mrs. Logan.
Well, so that would be the first Thursday in September, which I think is the 5th. I don't have a calendar. Sorry.
Yes, it is the 5th. First Thursday in September, then we reconvene.
So that would be, yep, September 5th at 7 p.m. Will be the next regularly scheduled meeting.
September 5th.
September 5th.
Is that date acceptable to you, Mr. Mendez?
What day is that? Thursday.
Thursday.
You can make it work.
Mr. Johnson, that acceptable to you too?
That works for me, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Does he have to do that in a motion?
I did not. I just want to make sure.
Does that have to be a motion?
Yeah, but we had to pull enough information to make it. So I proposed that we postpone the decision until 7 o'clock in the evening of the 5th of September. Do I have a second to that motion?
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Ayes have it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see if we can work our way out of this predicament.
We appreciate it for everybody.
And we'll keep everybody, we'll move forward, because he's already indicated we're gonna get more comments, so we might as well get things set up.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bean, for being here to assist us. Mr. Petty, do you have anything else to come before us this evening?
As we can still tell, we are a member short. We have not received any applications for the vacancy for the North River seat. We have reached out to Chairman Murray to see if he knows anybody who might be willing to take this. And we'll keep you updated if anybody comes in. And then again, we have received some interest in some folks in the floodplain who may be seeking variances. They have existing structures that don't meet setbacks or yard placement, who may be coming forward to seek variances while in the floodplain.
Okay. Mrs. Logan, do you have anything for us?
No, sir, that's all.
Hearing nothing? Motion to adjourn?
Well, are we planning to do, how are we gonna come up with anything in 30 days? I mean, 30 days will be here. What's your proposal for that?
I think we should speak with building inspections department.
That's what I think. I think if we could meet or you staff meet with building inspections and
Yes, ma'am.
come back
I'll be happy to
to.
go. Roll my sleeves.
I mean, if there's some expedited way of handling the floodplain stuff, I don't know. I mean, building inspections,
Because it's gonna come up again and again
uh,
and again.
it is.
And we might as well get prepared and whatever we come up with can serve as a mold. Because the citizens want to know when they walk in the door, what do I gotta do?
Let me just mention, in going through the community assistance visit that we had with FEMA, I sent out over 50 letters to various property owners. This was a very unique situation because it was agriculturally based. Most of what we have are for recreational development or a garage or a shed that's utilized for,
Nobody knows it's liability.
excuse me?
Nobody knows it's liability.
That's correct. In a couple of cases, they were given incorrect information, or they were told by a contractor they would possibly pull the permits, and that, you know. And so, in any case, not to get into a lot of detail, I would say primarily most of what we see are residential-related sheds and garages that are utilized in just kind of standard residential use, whether it be for storage of the vehicle or recreational equipment. Much of what we saw was there for a significant amount of time. So we are making determinations on that. We can give that report to you at the next meeting. Been working on a spreadsheet for Ms. Logan. I should have everything together by then. I'd be glad to provide that. And to Mr. Mendes' legal rep, if he needs that.
Thank you for your help tonight. I'm not sure that, I think we're on a path in the direction we want to go. But let's see if we can't help. And we will talk to the board of supervisors, because they're going to have to make just quick decisions. But ultimately, the citizen walks in and says, geez, I want something. We'll make sure you give them the best information possible.
This is the first situation we've had of an agricultural building being built without permits in the floodplain that I can remember. I've been here a long time, and have been doing BZA for.
Well, maybe you may want to have a dance hall.
We've been through that.
We haven't had this issue in the floodplain, so we'll look at it and we can reconvene in 30 days.
Great, thank you.
September 5th.
You have a motion to adjourn?
So the
Thank you for coming out to see me. Thank you.